Good morning and welcome to Atheist Talk on KTNF AM950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. We appreciate you tuning in this morning. Today is Sunday, April 26, 2015. I am your host, Mike Harbeck, and our guest today is Neil Carter, whose Patheos blogs are Godless and Dixie and Excommunications. During this live show, we welcome to your phone calls at 952-946-6205 and your emails to radio@minnesotaatheists.org. Another survey from the Pew Group indicates that the number of nuns in America has grown over the last 2 years by 7.5 million people. Atheists tend to get overexcited whenever the number of respondents who self-designate as unaffiliated grows. They use that word, but I do not think it means what we think it means. They may be people who are religious but don't join a specific church or denomination, or consider them spiritual but not religious. Neil Carter has written that the important subset of the nuns is the Duns on his blog, Godless and Dixie. Good morning, Neil.
Hey, how you doing?
Well, you?
I'm doing great.
Good, and glad to have you on the show. Before we get to the main topic, though, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about something else that was exciting that you're involved in regarding the media and atheists. You're one of the featured subjects in a segment of CBS's Sunday morning on the topic of atheists, and there's a link to a video of this show on the show announcement page for today. How did you come to be involved in that segment in the first place?
Well, I've been connected with the openly secular campaign since it first started. Some friends of mine told me they were putting that together, and I submitted one of my videos for that campaign, just a short little 2-minute thing that says, "Hi, my name is Neil, and I'm openly secular." And I tell a little bit of why I am. So I was connected with the campaign already, and then at one point they put out some feelers to find out if anybody had any stories that they could tell that could explain what it's like to be an atheist, particularly in parts of the country where that's very unacceptable, socially speaking. So I shared some of my story with them, and then before I knew it, I was getting contacted by CBS to feature my story along with the others.
Well, that's great. Now, did Mo Rocca and the producer accurately edit the story to reflect the interview and the information that you provided them?
Yes, I really think they did. They were very sensitive to the fact that there are a lot of wrong ways we could go with the story, and it was a very sensitive, touchy subject because of family relations and because of cultural differences in this area. And I thought they handled it really responsibly. They cut out a lot. You know, we recorded more than an hour's worth of video, but they stuck to the parts that really fit with the flow of the rest of the story. They did a good job.
I think it's kind of natural they have to in order to be able to fit in their segment time frame. But were there some items that you had discussed that were cut out from the interview and that you think were important that you would like to have, gotten out or had people nationwide hear you say?
I feel like they hit the important stuff. Some of what we talked about that got cut was when we were talking about legal issues. One of the things the Openly Secular campaign has done recently is drawn attention to the fact that there are still laws technically on the books in 7 states that outlaw atheists holding public office. And it's a complicated story to cover because technically those are unenforceable laws. But the problem is that there's still something symbolic being communicated by the presence of those laws on the books. And I gave comparisons of what it would be like if those laws said, for example, that a Jew cannot run for public office, or that a black person cannot run for public office. Even if it weren't enforceable, we still would jump to take it off the books because it's an embarrassment to the state. But when we contacted state officials in Mississippi about that law being on the books, their response was, well, I don't think we would have had popular support to get rid of it. And one guy that was even the chair of the Constitutional Committee for the state said, you know what, honestly, I think most Mississippians prefer that law stay in the books. So that was a major issue I wanted to talk about. But the Openly Secular campaign is not in and of itself a legal challenge, as some other organizations are. So it didn't really fit with the way the direction of the interview was going.
Now you've got a post on Godless and Dixie just you put up a couple of days ago about your participation in Openly Secular campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, it's pretty close to my heart because in this area there are so many people who can't be, and it makes a big difference to them that somebody can.
Just to be able to know that you've got some support out there and you're not all alone, I think is probably pretty important to a lot of people that are either atheists, agnostics, or just don't fit in with the standard Southern Or, we even run into that in Minnesota with the Lutherans. They get a little bit shocked sometimes to find out that we aren't that we aren't members of the coffee brigade, I guess you'd call it.
Right. It's not just a Southern thing. It's a Midwestern thing as well. And honestly, in most places in the United States, the farther away you get from a city, the more you're going to run into this same culture.
And I was kind of surprised. I lived in Texas for a while, and I moved back to Minnesota, where I was originally from. I was really kind of surprised at how religious it still was here in Minnesota. Kind of forgot because I'd been away for about 10 years or so. Did the airing of the show cause any difficulties for you?
It did. Initially, the support that came in was really encouraging because online I have a lot of friends that were supportive of that cause. But the local paper here in Mississippi also covered the story 2 days later, which made a big difference because where I live is really provincial. They really don't pay attention to national news. They pay attention to local news. And so when it hit the local papers, there was a big buzz that was generated, and a lot of phone calls were made, and a lot of emails have flown, and it's ruffled some feathers here locally. So, yes.
So even at the gym, you've run into some people that...
Right. So the folks at the gym, they read the paper, and since it was in the paper, now all of a sudden everybody's staring at me as I'm working out in the gym, and I've already been approached by a couple of different folks who are evangelizing me. But you have to understand that where I live, that's actually not that unusual. That's not even special treatment. We have so many people that just evangelize as a regular mode of conversation that it's not that unusual. But it's going to intensify for me now.
Would you do this again? Would you be on a national show talking about your atheism and being openly secular?
Certainly. Yeah, let's do it again.
Okay. Well, here you are.
Here I am.
We're not quite CBS, but we do our best.
Right.
So I'd like to move on to your background a little bit, where you grew up, and what was your religious background? Did you grow up in a secular family?
No. My family is Southern Baptist, and we really weren't very deeply involved in the church growing up. We were sort of nominally involved. We attended Sunday school and Sunday worship. We were Southern Baptists, and, it's a more religious evangelical culture than some others. It's not quite like a lot of the Catholic friends that I have who you just pretty much show up, you do your thing, you go home, and it doesn't really touch anything else in your life. But Southern Baptist life, it's a little bit more inclusive than that. And compared to most others who are involved in our church, we were sort of only moderately involved growing up. I was actually the first one that got more intensely involved in church. When I was a teenager, a conversion experience that made me a lot more gung-ho. And the next 20 years were pretty much intense devotion to my faith. And since that time, I've now left my faith. While my family, it's flip-flopped. Now my family is actually way more involved than they were when I was young. And so it's become a bigger part of their life.
Maybe what you did was you did a pretty good job at evangelizing to them while you were still religious.
It's possible. I don't know.
Too good of a job,
But, it's also a cultural shift as well. I don't know what it is, but somehow or another, it's, the tables have turned.
As a religious person, were you familiar with the tools of skepticism?
Yes. I would just call that critical thinking skills. And everybody's exposed to that in schools. It's a decent education, which I was, and I did have a decent education. And honestly, as a Christian, I was interested in studying foreign religions and even cults. And I understood how to critically evaluate those. But what I never did learn to do is turn those same tools on my own beliefs. There's protective mechanisms around your beliefs that make you, whether you're able to see the flaws in other people's thinking or not, you can't see the flaws in your own because, for example, guilt is something that surrounds your beliefs. So if you start to analyze the things you were taught to believe, you're actually made to feel guilty for questioning them, which is a really sneaky trick that people play on themselves to protect their own belief systems. But that's what I was taught to do, too. I was taught to see questioning my faith as a moral flaw. And I know that's the way people around me see it. They don't see it as an intellectual difference that I don't believe in God. They see it as a moral failing to submit myself to someone that I'm supposed to just know is real.
No, I know, too, and I had kind of a similar experience. Even though I was Catholic, I did, in my teen years, I had like a conversion experience in a evangelical type of faith. and the people that I got to know from that would go to Bible study meetings that were focused on other religions as cults, including what a lot of people consider mainstream religions, like, well, Catholicism, but also Mormons and so forth. And they could apply those critical thinking skills towards those religions, saying, this is kind of silly that they believe in that. But to look at, a Bible-focused type of, Nazarene or Baptist type of religion, that was just something that they didn't feel like they could ever or would ever really need to do because they had the truth.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So, but you are kind of an analytical person. You teach math. And
I do, but math is not where I started. I am an analytical person. I started out with English and history, and even before that, I was teaching Bible and philosophy. My degrees were in psychology and in biblical studies. So, but I went into teaching because I never really wanted to be a part of a traditional ministry. I was always a little bit of an iconoclast, and was eventually drawn to more of a house church movement, and that's where I spent the last 10 years as a Christian, was in something that was a lot different from what I grew up with. And during that time, teaching was, what I did for a living, and it still is. But I started out with English and history when I got to teaching public school, and ran into problems a few years back with that, and that'll come out later in our story. But I picked math because it's less controversial.
We're going to go to a break now. Yeah, we're going to go to break now. We'll pick up after that on the rest of your experience here. Welcome back to AM950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. This is Atheist Talk. I'm your host, Mike Harbeck. Today's guest is Neil Carter. Welcome back to Atheist Talk. Before we went on to the break, Neil, we were talking about your conversion or your recognition of the fact that you're skeptical or you're an atheist. And I had to cut you off, and I'd just like to continue from where we were.
Sure.
Okay. So, as you thought about your religion, something, I guess, kind of clicked in you, or what happened?
Well, it was a long, slow process for me. Like I said on the CBS interview, I've always lived with an inner skeptic. But the questions that I've had, I've always seen them as just side occupations that need to kind of be squelched in the interest of keeping my faith strong. But I just got to a point in my mid-30s where I faced the questions more squarely. And when I did that, I realized I didn't have good answers for these things. And honestly, if I considered the alternative hypothesis, which is that all this stuff is made up, really the world made a lot more sense that way. A lot of things started fitting better. And after wrestling with it for a number of years, I just got to the point where I realized I really didn't believe it anymore.
Now, so we'll go into this, this column that you wrote, because of the fact that we're kind of moving into that now. There was a poll, like I had mentioned on the intro, that was done by the Pew Charitable Trust. They do it frequently to get like a sense of the religious flavor of the country. Every once in a while, and there's this huge group that keeps on growing every year, that are unaffiliated. And I know that when atheists talk about it, they discuss it, they look at that number and they think, great, there's more and more of us. But that's not necessarily what they mean by unaffiliated. They're not necessarily talking about the fact that they're atheists, are they?
No, they're not. Well, the number is something like 25% of the country identifies as unaffiliated. And if you stick with people under the age of 30 or 35, I think it is, then it jumps to more like a third of the population identifies as nuns. But that's really not that's not accurate. Well, it's accurate, except that a lot of those unaffiliated are Christians and or some other religious perspective, but they just don't affiliate officially with any one group. Maybe they've just sort of drifted out of attendance. They don't really find a church that fits them, so they don't really have a label that they're willing to pick. If you narrow the search to just how many Americans, what percentage of Americans identify as atheist, the number drops down to something like 4%. And if you include atheist and agnostic, I think it jumps to maybe 6% or 7% at the most. So that large number of nuns is really misleading if you approach that thinking these are people who are skeptics and critical thinkers and even atheists, because that's not accurate at all.
And even when we talk about atheists now, There's another subset that you have written about that's pretty important to distinguish here, and that's pretty much the subject of the show that we're finally getting into 25 minutes in, and those are the Nuns. And what do you mean by the Nuns?
Well, the Nuns are people who are not only currently not attending a church and currently not affiliated, they're more deliberately disassociating themselves from the whole thing. A nun could be somebody who's just sort of fallen by the wayside. It's almost like a passive non-involvement. A nun is somebody who's left on purpose, and chances are they've once been a part of a religious tradition, and now they're not anymore. So to me, a nun would also be distinguished from atheists who have never been religious and aren't connected to religious culture at all. The Nuns are those people who are former believers, and there's a different quality to the way they approach atheism. You know, the involvement they have with the subject matter is different. And many times it's even more passionate, or at least it's a passion that directs itself in a slightly different manner. So the Nuns are the people who are former believers, who are speaking as former insiders, and they just have a different approach to how they talk about these things.
I'm just going to maybe sidetrack a little bit because I think we have some time on this. There's within the Nuns. Do you think that backsliders? Because I know that in a lot of evangelist traditions, there's like a group of people that are referred to as backsliders. Do they? Do you know what I'm referring to, or is that not used anymore?
Yeah, I do. No, I do. That's something that they say all the time. In fact, when I did a Google search to see if anybody else had given that distinction between nuns and duns, it turns out some Baptist preachers have actually used the exact same distinction. And for them, they were not thinking about people who used to be genuine believers and now are not, because for many of them, they don't think there is such a thing. This is one of the problems we run into, and it's one of the reasons why I'm making the distinction. I think it's a useful distinction for many atheists to realize is there, but it's also a useful distinction for some of the religious to recognize. And where I come from, they find it hard to recognize that people could have been one of them at one point, and now they're not. Because they have a theology that says, once you're saved, you're always saved. So if you're not one now, then everything you tell them about how you used to be one is invalid. And they'll begin looking for ways to invalidate your former experience, which, of course, silences your voice. Now they don't have to listen to anything you say. They could have learned something from you. But if you listen to the preachers who are using this term, they're referring to folks who are backslidden, like you said, which for them just means there's a whole lot of people who used to come to church and now they don't. And, of course, the fault must be theirs. It's not that the church itself doesn't have anything to offer them that they need. It's just that they're morally weak now and they need to get more recommitted. And now they've become lukewarm, and that's to them what a dun is. Because, like I said, they can't really, many of them can't even recognize that you used to legitimately be one of them.
With a backslider, it could be somebody, too, that's just kind of like temporary feeling their oats and having a wild time and doing things that are not church-like, and then they'll come back once they realize the error of their ways. And even my own...
and the thing is, you don't have to leave church to do that.
Yeah, even my own dad, when he found out that I was on this radio show, I asked him how he felt about that, and he was a Catholic, and he had kind of went back after he had had a heart attack. He went to the Paschal wager thing and got to be a strong Catholic again, and I asked him about it, and he said, well, I think it's just a phase, and I was 49 years old at the time.
Right, yeah, how long does a phase last exactly?
Yeah, but it was kind of a way of silencing me and kind of not really engaging in why I'm an atheist, so...
It's very patronizing, and one of the most common responses I've gotten from people, they're well-meaning, they really are, but they come up to me and they say, we all go through hard times, and I too have been through hard times, which, of course, that means they're assuming that the reason that I'm not a believer anymore is because maybe bad things happened to me. And that frustrates the stew out of me because it's not fair. That's not a fair assessment of why I don't believe anymore. In fact, I didn't have hard times at all until after I left. And most of those hard times were as a result of people treating me differently and looking at me differently. But when they say, we've all had hard times, it'll pass, that's patronizing because now you're sort of talking down to me and you're making it sound like you've made it past this phase and you're just waiting for me to grow up.
Right, yeah. And what I'm going to do is we're going to be going to a break here pretty soon, and we actually did get a fairly lengthy email yesterday that I think was relevant to the show. And what I want to do when we come back in is I want to lead off with that email, and I think you've had a chance to read it and see what it's about. So I'd like to discuss that and then continue on with some of the points you made in your blog post. So please stay with us through the break, and we'll return to Atheist Talk with our guest, Neil Carter. This is Mike Hodrick, and you're listening to AM950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. The Nuns versus the Duns may sound like a tag team wrestling match or the name of a court case, but in this show, we are making an important distinction. The Nuns are a very large set of respondents in religious polls, people unaffiliated with religion. It's a rather imprecise definition of people's religious position. The Duns are a small subset of this. We are people who have been religious at some point in our lives, but came to the realization that religion is not for us, and so we leave it as atheists or agnostics. Neil Carter, a math teacher in Mississippi, wrote a blog post explaining why the distinction between the Nuns and the Duns is important, and is the guest on today's show. Welcome back to Atheist Talk on AM950 KTNF, the voice of Minnesota. I am your host, Mike Hodrick. If you have a question or a comment, please call us at 952-946-6205 or email to radio@minnesotaatheist.org. Neil Carter, welcome back to Atheist Talk.
Thank you.
All right. We had received an email at Minnesota Atheist, at radio@Minnesota Atheist, and it came in yesterday, but I think it's kind of relevant to the topic that we have on the show. I'd like to go ahead and read that and discuss that next here. And this is from EG. So, while established, a similar-minded clique of people, sub-tribes, is essential to human society, and speaking out as an atheist is important to reach people who are de facto religious because of their birth, and those people need to know it is all right to be in church. There is something missing. What is missing, I think, is emphasis that what people do and what they claim they do for the sake of blending with society at large. We should be happy that is the case, in that we are not surrounded by Bible literalist zealots. Understanding the South is a good example of the extreme. How does that mechanism work differently in the South, if indeed it is different? How do people born into a punishing faith accept that they are not literalists without turning into hardcore Bible thumpers in the realization? If we wanted people to be true what they profess, the world would be full of cult extremists or old-timey Old Testament hardliners. There's a book out about whether or not we need shame as a social tool, and ultimately what turns people either to religion or to the religion that they don't buy into, realization that they don't buy into religion, is that sort of aha moment, a conscious translation that is a result of pivotal trauma that pushes them over the top one direction or another. From my take of it, often it's an emotional watershed moment. Until that time, it's go along to get along. But in that question in there, how does that mechanism work differently in the South? Do you think it is? I don't know if you had experience with the North.
Well, I've interacted with people online, and I'm trying to figure out exactly what the question is and all of that. I think I get it, but the question is, how does the different mentality work in the South versus it does in the North? Is that the heart of the question? That's
what I'm taking as it, and I hope, E.G., if you hear that, if we bring this out a different way than you intended, I apologize for it, but this is what we're working with. Yeah.
So here's the way I understand the question. First of all, I would characterize religion in the South, and really in evangelicalism in general, as an expression of Christianity that de-emphasizes behavior and character, and it de-emphasizes physical acts of caring for other people in the interest of emphasizing orthodox belief. You know, it's more about believing the right things than it is about doing the right things. You know, in evangelical faith, that's what gets you into heaven. Mm-hmm. What gets you into heaven is not that you're a good person, and not that you care for people, and not that you're a forgiving person. In evangelical theology, what gets you into heaven is whether or not you believe the right things about how you get saved itself.
So salvation by grace, yeah.
Yeah, it's about accepting the plan of salvation. Now, if you press them on that issue, they'll say, yes, but you're also supposed to submit yourself to God and yada, yada, yada. But then when they start talking about how you get into heaven, they fall back on this belief that it's about thinking the right way about salvation itself. It's almost like they have faith in faith itself. So anybody who doesn't approach faith the same way, even people who are within the Christian umbrella but not the right kind, they actually think that those people don't get into heaven, like Catholics, for example.
Right.
As a Baptist, I grew up believing that many Catholics won't get into heaven because they are relying on their good works or on the sacraments or whatever to get them into heaven. And Baptists believe that that's not right. And if you don't believe the right way about that, you're not going to get in. So there's this emphasis on believing the right things rather than doing the right things. And as a result, you have these churches that are obsessed with getting people to believe the right things, but they're not really doing a whole lot to get people to do the right things. You know, you've got Jesus telling people to give to the poor and the needy and to care for each other and to forgive one another and to not judge one another. But you look around at the way churches are distinguishing themselves in my area, and they're doing just the opposite of what he said to do. So, you know, what you've got is a totally different cultural approach to Christianity here than you have in other places. And to me, that's the different mechanism that's working, is they've got a totally different theology, a totally different set of priorities. And it works itself out in the culture in such a way that, ironically, if I can get into politics for just a second, it actually makes them ripe for the picking for political conservatives, because you've got this whole voting base, talking millions of people,
AM950, this is Atheism Sucks.
believe that they're supposed to have, they believe they want Christian leaders in government, but the way they define what a Christian leader looks like is really, really skewed, and it seems to have nothing to do with the kind of ethical stuff you see Jesus talking about in the Bible. It's become disassociated from things like caring for the poor, and it's become instead associated with random things that Jesus never even talked about, like fighting gay marriage or abortion. And what you've got is you've got a whole political party that's using these hot-button issues that, frankly, I'm not even sure they care that much about, because it doesn't really fit with conservative politics. I mean, conservative politics is supposed to be about getting the government out of people's business, but lately they seem like they're going the opposite direction. And that's because of their connection with the white evangelicals that they've been courting for the last 40 or 50 years. It's a part of the Southern strategy. But you've got this whole group of people ripe for the picking for politicians to come along and pander to them, even though the priorities they're communicating as a political party have nothing to do with caring for the poor. They're actually just the opposite. They're actually trying to cut out assistance for the poor. So they're about as opposite from the Christian faith as you can get. And yet where I'm from, all Christians believe they're supposed to vote for that party. So it's like it's an amazing sleight of hand that they've done, and they've duped an entire population of people into thinking that this is what their religion is about. It's about pushing leaders into place that actually have nothing to do with what their religion is supposed to be about. And the way that happened is because they've gotten such a strong disassociation between the ethical demands of their faith and the, I don't know what to call it, the dogmatic demands of just believing the right things about salvation. So that's one of the major differences you get between Southern religion and evangelical religion versus the more liberal religion you might find in other parts of the country.
Sure, even something as simple as baking a cake for a wedding for a gay couple, defining that as freedom from religion, for religious freedom to be able to deny the services for those people.
Right. Well, one of the best illustrations of that I've heard is that if you listen to the way Jesus talked about what it was like to be persecuted, he talked about embracing it, and not like in a whining, complaining kind of way, but almost as a part of their calling. And he told people that were being oppressed by the Roman government that if someone tells you to carry their backpack for 1 mile, you should offer to carry it for 2. So it's more like, you know, I think a Christian response to this whole should you bake a cake for a gay family is make them 2. You know?
And turn the other cheek and say, okay, go ahead and slap this one too.
Well, it's clear that they don't really believe the things that Jesus said. They think they do, but really what they're embracing is a version of Christianity that they were taught from the time they were young. And it appears to me to have almost nothing to do with what Jesus himself taught.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, I consider myself as a done, too, now that I see your definition of it, and which is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show. One of the things that really hits me, too, is that it bothers me as a done to hear other atheists talk about believers as being idiots or being mentally ill. Why do we, as dones, react so emotionally to these sorts of charges?
To which parts?
Well, the fact that, like, if somebody... If you talk to another atheist and they are talking about something that somebody from a religion has done, they'll talk about that other person as being an idiot or being mentally ill. I react negatively to that.
Yes, me too. Well, it does happen way too much, and that is one of the differences between nuns and duns. And at this time when I'm making the distinction, I would say that there is often a distinction between people who have never been religious versus people like me who once were. Mm-hmm. And I should hasten to add that not everybody has problems with that. Some people just have a natural empathetic nature, and they know how to put themselves in the shoes of the believer and see things from their perspective, and so they don't tend to belittle them and look down on them and talk down to them. So not everybody does this. But I do see that more often than not, people who have never been religious have a hard time grasping how people of faith think. And as a result, they can't imagine that these people have fully functioning intellects, and so they talk down to them. And they do call them stupid because the beliefs look insane. You know, I mean, it's insane to believe that snakes talk. Mm-hmm. And I think it's even insane to believe that people come back from the dead. But the thing is, that's been validated by large groups of people accepting it.
Sure.
It's still not rational, but I wouldn't call that mental illness because, first of all, if you know anything about mental illness, you know that it's distinctly separate from what we're talking about. This is something that's more of a learned habit of thinking that incidentally can be changed, whereas mental illness is not so simple. With religious dogma, it's just a matter of critically analyzing it, and in time it can be picked apart. And it's not that these people are not intelligent, because I've known too many incredibly intelligent, well-educated Christians. It's just that they don't apply the same critical thinking skills to their religion that they do to everything else.
Okay. And we've got a caller coming in from Alabama, but we don't have quite enough time in this segment, perhaps. Well, okay. What we could do is we could take the call, and then if he's willing to hang on through the break for the response, we can do that. And this is actually from your neighboring state, from Alabama. His name is John. John, thank you for calling Atheist Talk.
Hi, how are you guys doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for calling. Did you want to go ahead and ask Neil a question?
Yeah. Neil, I'm kind of curious if you could describe the dynamic between when you were a Christian and when you came out of religion. I don't know if you know what I mean.
What do you mean? You mean how I worked my way out?
No, like how you were as a Christian compared to how you are now as an atheist. Like as far as I guess morals or just your general worldview. Like how do those two different worldviews differ for you?
Okay. Yeah, I could definitely answer that. Do you want me to do that after the break, or do you want me to start now?
No, we got it about 30 seconds, then we'll go to the break, and you can continue the answer if you'd like that.
All right. Well, I would say, in shortest version is that my personality is the same. I think that my own personal moral compass is really the same. I'm a little bit more consistent the way I work out some of my ideas. And I also think I've gotten a little bit better at dismantling some of the negative self-talk that I learned as a Christian. Mm-hmm. That's been one of the biggest struggles for me, because that negative self-talk affects my relationships with other people. So I wouldn't say that I've gotten a whole new moral system. I really feel like I believe a lot of the same things in terms of what it means to be good and loving toward people. But I've got a little bit more of a critical thinking approach to that works through some of the mind games that I learned as a Christian. And particularly I learned to not hate myself so much as I used to.
Okay, and we're going to have Dan Finca on the show in a couple of weeks here, and we're going to talk about those kinds of things too. Please stay with us through the break, and we'll return to Atheist Talk with our guest, Neil Carter. I am Mike Hoppick, and you're listening to AM950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. And now, back to Neil Carter. Okay, Neil, this is just our last segment. We got a couple of things left I wanted to touch on. In your post, you give some advice to evangelicals on how to talk to duns. And of course, I mean that facetiously. We don't necessarily want to be preached to anymore. Why is it that if a person wants to know about the four spiritual laws, for example, that we tend to roll our eyes?
Yeah, I would want Christian friends to realize that we really have heard what they've got to say before, and I'm trying to save them the effort. Mm-hmm. and kind of spare us both the process of going through this, because we start to get headaches from suppressing the eye rolls. It's not just that we've heard everything they've got to say before, we've actually taught it ourselves, mm-hmm. and we've put it into practice ourselves, maybe longer than they have. And so what I would like to do is just tell them to cool their jets Put the evangelism away just for a minute and just have a normal conversation with us and get to know us, because we'll actually save a lot of time that way and save a lot of grief. And I would love it if they could recognize that it's not just that we've been exposed to these things before, but for many of us, we got sick of them a long time ago, sick of hearing them. And for some of us, they might even be emotional triggers, because some people have had really bad experiences in their religious background, especially very fundamentalist backgrounds. But people like me, I was not really a fundamentalist, and I didn't have a bad time as a Christian. But working my way out of it, things got much more stressful because of all the guilt that they put on you when you start doubting your faith. So really it was as I was working my way out of it that things turned bad for me. So for a lot of us, these things, revisiting even certain phrases and Bible verses and, sales pitches, basically, they rub us the wrong way. And I wish they would just learn to hold back on those things, even though it's their instinct, and just have a regular conversation with us.
Just get to be friends with us rather than feel like they have a mission towards us.
Exactly. Don't make me feel like a prospect. Because the thing is, I can tell when you're doing that.
Right. Because you have those skills yourself.
I've done it before. I mean, I wasn't as gung-ho about it as some others, because for me, I was always more interested in what they called relational evangelism. And if anything, maybe if I could just encourage them to, actually, I'd rather them drop the evangelism totally and just get relational. But if they're going to be evangelistic, I wish they could learn relational evangelism, which just basically means learn to be my friend and quit giving me all the sales pitches.
Especially like the 4 spiritual laws. So,
right.
Or the chick tracts and stuff like that. So,
or now it's please go watch God's Not Dead, or some other thing like that. If you'll just watch this video, it's wonderful. It's really life-changing, but really it's not.
Right. As you've over the last few years, as you've come into your own as a out secular atheist, have you found new outlets in your social life and beyond online, but in your hometown or your city down in Mississippi? Have you had good luck with making new friends among either atheists or people that aren't, of a religious nature?
Well, it's been fairly dependent upon building friendships online, simply because I've had a very busy life. For about 3 years there, I was working 7 days a week and had up to 3 jobs at a time. So financial difficulties just put me in a position where I couldn't hardly have a social life except what was online.
Right.
But locally, I've gotten to meet a number of non-believers through our local Facebook group. When I first joined about 3 years ago, there were only about 100 people in the Mississippi Atheist Facebook group, and now there's it's closer to 600.
Wow.
It's grown a lot in a really short amount of time, and a lot of it comes from taking the time to get to know each other online. It probably helps a little bit that some of us are coming out or becoming more openly secular, as they say. It helps identify people. I'm catching people all the time through the blog and through Facebook comments and through YouTube comments and wherever. And if I find out they're from Mississippi, I invite them to the group as fast as I can. So the group's been growing, and a lot of it's through word of mouth. But also there's a new humanist group that's gotten started, the Mississippi Humanist Association. So there's a local gathering as well, besides the meetup, where folks are getting together and looking for projects to do to try to contribute to the area. So I see a lot of potential for growth in that. We're hoping to get together in Oxford, Mississippi this weekend, as a matter of fact, to see if we can't get together some of the Ole Miss college students and get some of the North Mississippi folks together to eat lunch. So we're working on ways to get together.
That sounds like it'd be a lot of fun. I always think of Oxford as being the writer's town,
It is.
So there's got to be a lot of intellectuals there and a lot of opportunity for atheist and humanist groups down there. The one thing that I had forgotten and I really wanted to mention, and we've got just about a minute and a half before I've got to take over here. After you became an atheist, you posted something on Facebook, and a student found it and asked you a question. What were the ramifications, or what happened there?
A student came to class and grilled me in front of the class and asked me if I was an atheist, and I refused to answer the question, which made me unlike any other teacher they had. So most here wear their religion on their sleeve. And the fact that I refused to answer the question told them everything they needed to know. So they began spreading it around that I was an atheist, and my principal eventually confronted me about that and began to tell me what I could and couldn't teach in my classroom, which was, of course, against the law. You're not supposed to do that. Then they moved me out of that class into a math class a month or two later, and at the end of the year, they told me they weren't going to bring me back the next year. So So I've had a number of ramifications that came out of that.
And again, do you regret this at all, or do you feel like it's been a good thing for you in the long haul?
Honestly, that's a complicated question.
Okay.
I've lost a lot of things that matter a lot to me.
Mm-hmm.
But now that these things have happened and it can't be undone, I'm making the best of it that I can. And now that I've gotten connected to enough people who are in similar situations to what I was in before, where they're completely closeted and they aren't free to talk, I see that I've got an opportunity to speak for them. And that makes what I'm doing make a difference. And if I could put in a plug for one quick thing before we cut out. I've gotten connected with Recovering from Religion over the last couple of years. It's an organization based in Kansas City. No, wait, where are they based? Kansas City? Anyway, I've been working online so much I forget where people are. Recovering from Religion was a big deal for me, and they've been very helpful in reaching out to me. And they recently started something called a hotline project, where you call this phone number, 184, I doubt it, and people can ask any questions that they've got and work through their questions and their doubts. And there's a non-judgmental person to listen to on the other end. And I'd love to see the word for that get out.
If you would send me that number again, I'll put it on our page to make sure it's included on that. I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in to Atheist Talk. This is Mike Harbrick, your host. Join us next Sunday, and our guest will be Victoria Gibson. I'm proud to be on the air with the Minnesota Atheists, and I hope that you appreciate the show. The show depends on the generous support of our members, our sponsors, and our donors. Please consider supporting this show through the donation link at mnatheist.org. This has been Atheist Talk on AM950 KTNF, the voice of Minnesota. The podcast for the show